Okay.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hi. I'd like to know what does time and space have to do with our um, present time and relevant to what we are doing uh, at that present time?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. That's a really deep question. We don't really know what time is. If you look at this naturalistically, the human brain evolved. There's good evidence for that, from beginning with one-celled creatures that were somewhat conscious of their surroundings. We've evolved these brains that are exquisitely adapted to living in the world. So the world that we see is not necessarily reality, but it's a presentation that the brain has learned to make from the various inputs, from the visual input, auditory input, tactile input, messages from the internal organs, all kinds of things. We're finding out now that the human nervous system is sensitive to magnetic fields. So that's there. So all of this, we have to realize that the brain has no contact, direct contact with the outside world, but only through these inputs, through the optical nerves and the auditory nerves. It's just encased in the brain in the dark. Mm-hmm. And so it has learned, evolved to construct a world that we see that will foster survival. We recognize fruit on a tree because we need to eat fruit in order to survive. So that's now the sensation of time is like that. We have evolved to see things sequentially, which may not really be sequential, but it serves our survival needs to see them as sequential. I'll give you an example of that. If I touch my toes, and this comes from a Professor David Eagleman, who's a neuro researcher, neuroscientist. Mm-hmm. If I touch my toes, it takes a fraction of a second for that nerve impulse to get from the toe to the brain and to be perceived as a touch. The taller you are, the longer it takes. And it's not a very brief interval. It's actually a sizable amount of time. It's a fraction of a second, but it's measurable. If you touch your nose, that signal will get to the brain much faster because it's right there. It doesn't have to travel the length of the body electrically. However, if someone touches you on the toe and the nose at the same time, you will not perceive a difference. Although there is a difference in the way that those signals strike the brain learns to account for that difference and to make it seem simultaneous, because that serves our need. The body is touched simultaneously, so we need to perceive it that way. And therefore, we are always living in the past, because the brain has learned to wait for about 1/10 of a second to make sure that no distant signal that should be included in the present, in the so-called present, has arrived. We're always living a fraction of a second behind. What we perceive as the present is really the past. In order to present a world that's coherent and works, we have to allow a time lapse so that the brain can put together these signals that arrive differently at different times into the coherent present. So there really is no present that we can experience as humans, except the trick of the brain. Another good example of this is if you're watching a video, maybe on YouTube, sometimes you'll see that the voice is not in sync with the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
That's noticeable. But that's because the voice and the image are too far apart. But they don't have to be right together to perceive it in sync. There can be a difference of about 1/10 of a second. Within that 1/10 of a second field, the brain will make this adjustment and put it in sync. It will make you imagine that the voice and the moving mouth is the same, and it really isn't. So time is a construction of the human brain. I don't know if I made this clear.
Yes, I understand perfectly. But that brings me to another question. So in reality, nothing exists unless I can perceive it.
Nothing exists, as far as you know, unless you can perceive.
Time and space, according to time and space.
Well, it's a very big jump, and I think an unwarranted jump, to say that nothing exists unless you perceive it. That's what you call solipsism. You make yourself the center of reality. But are you?
No.
Well, so then, yes, that's a good answer. So then how can it be that nothing exists unless we perceive it? We don't know what exists.
Because everything as you explained, everything happened within fraction of a second in the past.
Yes, but the point there, the point there is that we don't know what's out there. The brain is locked in the skull. It doesn't have eyes and ears. It gets these signals, and it has evolved to use those signals to navigate around biologically, to eat and mate and protect itself from injury and all of this. We've learned to do this. This has evolved over countless eons, really. And it leaves us with a human point of view, but no way to know what reality is. We have no way of knowing that. And that's my critique of all the spiritual teaching. The spiritual teachers are always yammering about reality and what's real and isn't real. They don't know. They don't have the slightest idea. It's all made up. All of it. It's entirely made up. And it's like a joke to me, but I see they get so serious about it, and they want to debate, or they want to sit there in splendid robes and lecture people about reality. And really, it's a fool's errand they're on, in my view, completely foolish.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
No more questions?
I have to ponder a little bit, because that, then I have where does this consciousness comes in that I have to realize, or I have, whatever the name is, I use consciousness, but not necessarily that.
Yeah.
Then where is that? What is that I have to know?
Yes. I think what you have to know is that we don't know what any of this is. We don't know what any of this is. It's really simple. We know what we know as humans, but a human is not the standard of reality for the universe or whatever. We're just these primate animals living on a planet. There are probably many other countless planets with life forms on them. That's what scientists believe now. And somehow we've become so inflated that we imagine that the human being is the measure of all things,
Right.
and we are not. We're not even, we may not even be the most intelligent animal on this planet. There's some evidence that whales may have more brain power than humans. They just don't show it because they don't need to work to make a living. They don't need to invent things. They don't need to build things. They're living in a perfect environment. They're living in a womb. They have no enemies. If they want food, they just open their mouth and swim through a school of fish or shrimp or whatever it is that they want to eat. And but apparently they have a language. They sing to one another. They have complex sex lives with families and mating and all of this the way that we do. And I have a feeling that humans are too big for their britches. And I think that's what we, in my understanding of what it means to be awake, that's how I understand it. That you see that you have a human point of view, you always will, and that one day you're going to die. And that's just the flow of life. And there's no reason to invent all these fairy stories about God and heaven and transcendence and perfect masters and all the rest of this garbage. And that's been my message for the last few years. And I'm really happy to be an advocate for it. There's very few of us at the moment. Very few.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are very good questions that you asked, you know.
Thank you.
Remember that that person doesn't know. They're just talking. They don't know what anything is. We don't. We have evolved to construct a world from these inputs. So what we're seeing is a kind of movie that the brain makes in order to walk around without bumping into things, in order to find what's good to eat, in order to find a mate, in order to care for our children, whatever it is. It all works. It evolved. And if you understand Darwin, what works continues and what doesn't work drops off. So what we have is a very finely tuned system of illusion. And we're living in that illusion. We're living in a world that seems solid, although we know very well from science that there's vast spaces between the molecules in this thing, but I don't perceive that. I don't perceive it because that will not help me to live. What I need to know is that things are solid, and if you bump into them, you'll get hurt. Not look at them and see there's vast space in there, you see, and I can just walk through the wall. No, you can't. Yes?
No.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Who wants to be tortured next?